welcome to the history of Rome. In a single generation, Rome had recovered from the devastation of the Gallic sack and regained its dominant position within the region. The plebes had demanded and received greater political power, culminating with the election of the first plebe consul in 366 BC, the year after Camillus shepherded the Licinian law through the Senate. I did not mention this last week, but the admittance of plebes into the consulship also saw the end of military tribunes with consular power as one of the highest offices of state. The dual consulship was reinstated for good, and the obsolete office of military tribune was never revived. Subsequent years would see other plebe firsts, including the first plebe dictator in 356 BC and the first plebe censor in 351 BC. Both feats achieved by a single man, Gaius Marcius Rutulus, who, over the course of his illustrious career, would also be elected consul 4 times. By 343 BC, the Romans were once again seen as the great force in central Italy, and, as we are about to see, this meant that their neighbors forever sought to involve them in squabbles that had nothing to do with Rome or Roman interests. The Romans were the big kid on the block every other kid wanted on their side. As I did last time, I would like to open this week with a quote from Livy, discussing the year hostilities began with the Samnites and its significance in the greater arc of Roman history. From now on, the wars described will be of greater importance. Our enemies were more powerful, and campaigns lasted longer and were mounted in remote areas. For this was the year when an attack was launched against the Samnites, a people who were strong both in resources and in arms. After the Samnite War, which was inconclusive, Pyrrhus was the enemy, and after him, the Carthaginians. What a series of momentous events. How often we were in mortal danger to enable us to raise up our empire to its present heights of grandeur, where only with difficulty it is sustained. Rome was on the precipice of its rise to greatness. The Samnites, as I've said previously, were a semi-nomadic tribe from the south-central section of the Apennines called Samnium. Starting in the 300s BC, the Samnites, along with a number of other hill tribes, began to come down out of the hills and onto the plains that lay between the mountains and the coastline. Some moved south and began to encroach on the Greek cities of Magna Graecia. Others, like the Samnites, began to move west and came down to a land known as Campania, which lay southeast of Rome. The Greeks in the south sent envoys across the Adriatic to beg for assistance in fighting off the hill tribes, and were answered by Alexander of Epirus, who sent an army to help rid the Greeks of the encroaching menace. As we will see later, this introduction of an army from Epirus would have far-reaching consequences for the Romans. 60 years later, an army from Epirus would again answer Greek calls for aid, only this time not to battle nomadic hill tribes, but rather the growing power of Rome. But we still have a ways to go before we get to that. The largest and most important city in Campania, where the Samnites were setting up shop, was Capua. Known for its rich soil and soft lifestyle, Capua was no match for the hardened Samnite warriors, so, like the Greeks, they cast about for a savior. Envoys were sent to the largest and strongest power in the region, Rome, to beg for aid. The Romans, however, turned the envoys away. Rome had already concluded a treaty with the Samnites and could not in good conscience break it. They had, after all, sworn oaths before the gods. The desperate Capuans then took an extraordinary step. They formally surrendered Capua, its land and citizens, to Rome, willingly making themselves subjects of Rome. The Senate could not look this massive gift horse in the mouth. The land controlled by Capua was some of the best in Italy, and the food it could provide would put the days of grain famine in the rearview mirror forever. The Romans accepted the surrender and sent their own envoys to Samnium, where they explained that Capua was now Roman territory and, as per their treaty, the Samnites must desist all attacks. The Samnites would have none of this and scoffed at the Roman envoys, taking the insulting step of ordering a raid into Campania right in front of the Roman legates. The Romans, offended by this obvious breach of protocol, felt they had no choice at this point but to declare war. And so the First Samnite War began. The two consuls for that year, 343 BC by our reckoning, were Aulus Cornelius Cassus, a capable if forgettable leader, and Marcus Valerius Corvus, a true blue member of the legendary Roman Heroes Club. He was a member of the prominent Valerian family, whose famous ancestral patriarch was Publius Valerius Publicola himself. The surname Corvus, or Raven, was earned as a young man while serving in the army. The legions were squaring off against an army of Gauls when a huge Gallic fighter stepped forward and challenged any Roman to single combat. Young Marcus Valerius, all of 22, stepped forward and accepted the challenge. As he approached the Gaul, a raven landed on his shoulder, a sign that the gods favored him. The Gaul was worried by this clear omen, but proceeded with the fight anyway, and the raven, far from leaving when the clash began, actually joined in, pecking at the Gaul's eyes while Valerius ran him through with his sword. Valerius triumphant, the raven flew off. The legions then swept into the Gallic line and defeated them almost without resistance. An auspicious, if obviously embellished, beginning to a career to say the least. Corvus would be elected consul for the first time the very next year at the unprecedented age of 23. Before dying at the also unprecedented age of 100, he would be elected consul 5 more times and named dictator twice. But getting back to the war with the Samnites, Corvus was sent to protect Campania, and his colleague Cossus was sent to invade Samnium. Between the two, they figured to have the Samnites at heel in no time. Corvus was the first to meet the enemy, and after a fierce battle at the base of Mount Garus, fiercer than the Romans expected, the Samnites were routed. It was not an easy victory, and put the Romans on notice that they were not fighting Volscian raiders anymore. Cossus, in Samnium, almost blundered his way into the destruction of his own army, but was saved by one of his tribunes. The consul had led his army into a ravine, and noticed only too late that the Samnites had taken up a position on the ridge and stood ready to shower them with projectiles. One of his tribunes, Publius Decius, noticed that the Samnites were positioned in the shadows of a steep hill, and if a company of Romans could take the hill, then they would be able to pin down the Samnites, allowing the legions to escape. Cossus immediately ordered Decius and a detachment of volunteers to execute the plan. Decius slipped up and took the hill before the Samnites realized what was going on, and immediately began pelting the Samnites with missiles. In the confusion, Cossus was able to withdraw his army to safety, but Decius was left on the hill, surrounded by an army of angry Samnites who had just been denied an easy victory. Secure on the high ground, the Roman detachment was able to hold out until nightfall, at which point, recognizing their hopeless position, they decided to risk death by sneaking through the Samnite army, rather than remaining on the hill and safely starving to death. They had gone about halfway through the camp when one of the soldiers dropped his shield on a sleeping Samnite. Decius immediately began yelling at his men to attack anything that moved. The Samnites, half asleep and panicked by the sudden violent commotion, did not know what or who to attack. Decius and his men made a break through the army, killing everything in their path. When they emerged on the other side, Decius took a head count and realized to his great pleasure that of the company of men he had led on a sure suicide mission, he had not lost a single man. In the morning they made their way to the Roman camp and were greeted to thunderous applause. Cossus was about to launch into a speech praising Decius when the tribune cut him off, saying that the Samnites were in complete disarray and the time to finish the job was now. Cossus took the advice and sent his army out. The Romans found the Samnites exactly as Decius had described, in confused disarray, attacked them immediately, and won easily. The Romans had now won their first 2 engagements with the Samnites, but the first had been an unexpectedly hard slog, and the latter would have been a disaster had it not been for the tactical blunder the Samnites had committed by not immediately falling on Cossus's legions. The third and final battle of the war was fought at Susula, near the border between Campania and Samnium. Envoys from that city came to Marcus Corvus with news that the army he had driven off was regrouping and planning to reinvade. Corvus ordered his army forward with all haste, leaving behind all non-essential personnel and gear, marching only with his infantry, cavalry, and what could be carried on their backs. This decision to pack light would prove, unexpectedly, to be the decisive factor in the coming fight. When Corvus arrived at Susula, he ordered a camp built. Due to the paucity of men and material, the camp turned out to be physically much smaller than the Samnites were used to seeing the Romans build. They assumed this meant that a smaller force was encamped, and all their strategic decisions flowed from this faulty assumption. They decided that the best course would be to starve the small Roman garrison out, and began preparing for a siege. The Samnite commanders, rather than keeping their army together, ordered foraging parties out across the countryside for supplies to sustain their army while they waited for the Romans to surrender. Corvus caught wind of the Samnite activities, and, as soon as the bulk of the army was scattered, he ordered his men to attack. The Samnites were shocked when the whole of the legions came pouring out of the small camp, not the minor detachment they had supposed they were dealing with. Corvus's army took the Samnite camp almost without a fight, and then spent the rest of the afternoon rounding up the dispersed Samnite foraging parties. The Battle of Sisula was over before it had really begun. This victory marked the end of the First Samnite War. Corvus and Cossus were both awarded triumphs, and Decius was given the Grass Crown for his heroics. The Grass Crown was the most prestigious and rarely given military honor, the highest decoration a Roman soldier could receive. It was given to an individual who single-handedly, or nearly single-handedly, saved an entire legion from destruction. It was a rare honor because it was granted only by a vote of the saved legionnaires themselves, and it took extraordinary circumstances for proud Roman soldiers to admit that they had to be rescued. But in this case it was universally understood that Decius had saved their butts, so Decius got the Grass Crown. After the fighting ended, however, the Romans were forced to deal with trouble from an unexpected source, their own legions. During the winter of 342-341 BC, the legions were garrisoned across Campania to keep an eye out for further Samnite aggression. The largest garrison was outside of Capua, the city famous for its soft, easy living and detrimental effect on military discipline. Indeed, as we would later see, some note a marked change in the power and endurance of Hannibal's army after spending the winter in Capua during the Second Punic War. The Roman garrison, cooped up for the winter in camp, looked on at the comfortable Capuans and began asking themselves why a people who could not even defend themselves were allowed to have so much when they, the soldiers who had secured the peace, were given so little. The consuls for that year began to hear mutinous rumors coming from the Campanian legions and took steps to nip the conspiracy in the bud, but the move backfired. Their plan was to quietly reassign the men identified as conspirators and shuffle groups of soldiers around so no hard plans could be laid. But the conspirators quickly caught on, and, rather than reporting to their new assignments, they collected at an arranged point and began to actively plot a rebellion. They were soon strong enough numbers-wise, but lacked a leader to make them a cohesive unit. In a classic display of counterproductive ego and pride, nobody was willing to submit to the command of anyone else, so they remained a body without a head. As they brainstormed for ways out of their dilemma, it was noted that an ex-general, Titus Quintius, lived in the area. Quintius had retired fully from public life, despising the backstabbing intrigue of Roman politics, and the conspirators decided he was the perfect choice to lead them. A company of men was sent to persuade the old man to join their cause. Quintius, however, wanted nothing to do with the mutinous rabble, but was persuaded when the men threatened to kill him and his whole family if he did not come along. Having successfully hijacked a leader, the revolt moved forward, and the men marched towards Rome, though what exactly they hoped to accomplish is unclear. They probably wanted to secure land grants in Campania, but how they thought the Senate, or the people of Rome, would simply give them what they wanted and then go on as if nothing happened is a mystery. The rebellion had taken on an irrational inertia all its own. Upon hearing the news that a rebellious army was marching on Rome, the Senate immediately named Marcus Corvus to the first of his two dictatorships, and he rode off at the head of a legion to stop the mutinous army. They met each other at the Alban Mount, near the birthplace of Romulus and Remus, but neither side was destined to draw their swords in anger. Instead, the occasion was defined by reconciliation and secured Corvus's place in the history books not just as a great warrior, but also a wise and compassionate leader of men. He was loved not just by the men he led that day, but also by the mutineers, most of whom had fought with him against the Samnites. Corvus implored them to put down their swords and not draw the blood of their fellow citizens. Quintius, the hijacked general, who wanted no part of the rebellion anyway, ordered his men to stand down, and the combined weight of these two towering figures compelled them to give up. Corvus then led a combined force back into Rome, where he famously asked for and received clemency for the rebellious soldiers. Corvus did not want the affair to remain a thorn in the side of Roman solidarity, and he made sure no soldier was cast off the census rolls or in any other way penalized for his actions. It was a singular case of leniency toward mutinous soldiers, and, Though Corvus was hailed forever as a great man for securing the leniency, his example was rarely followed by later generations, who treated any hint of mutiny quickly and without mercy. Soon after the abortive rebellion, a truce was formalized with the Samnites. The Campanians, however, were in no mood for peace, and allied themselves with a combined Latin army that took the fight into Samnium as a punitive response to the Samnite invasion of Campania. The Latin communities hoped to grab some Samnite land and enhance their own power in the region, hopefully securing better terms of alliance with Rome. The Samnites immediately appealed to the Romans to halt the attacks. The Romans agreed to order the Campanians, who were now their subjects, to halt, but claimed their treaty with the Latins granted them no authority over their own internal military decisions. And this decision had two effects. For one, it offended the Samnites, who thought the Romans were just hiding behind legalese and directing the Latins, subjects to Rome in all but name, to keep fighting illegally after the treaty had been established. Second, it perked the ears of the Latins, who took the Roman decision to mean that the Romans did not believe they could stop the Latins from what they were doing. The time was ripe, the Latins decided, to renegotiate their status with Rome. For over 100 years, they had sent men and money to fight Roman wars and were consistently given only a pittance of the spoils in return. Full equality, they decided, was theirs for the taking, and, turning away from the Samnites, they set their sights on Rome itself. Having just concluded one war, the Romans were about to be embroiled in another, the Latin War, which would not turn out exactly as the Latins planned, resulting in not full equality, but full subservience to Roman rule, and an end even to the appearance of independence. The First Samnite War would prove to be mere foreplay between the Samnites and Romans. The Romans had gotten the upper hand, but it could have just as easily gone the other way. The Second, or Great Samnite War, would start 20 years later and not last for 2 years, but 22 years. In that war, the Samnites would hand the Romans some of their greatest and most humiliating defeats. The Romans had, since their founding, used the Greek Phalanx system for their army, but soon found it unsuited for the mountainous terrain of Samnium. The Samnite cavalry and light infantry were able to easily outmaneuver the heavy Roman phalanx, forcing the Romans to completely overhaul their military structure before they could beat the Samnites in the field. But that war was still a generation away. Next week, the Romans will follow the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend and join forces with the Samnites to quash forever Latin dreams of independence. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. The outcome of the First Samnite War had been inconclusive. Yes, the Romans had gotten the better of it in battle, but nothing resembling a definitive conclusion was reached. The Samnites seemed content to consolidate their gains and not press the issue, and the Romans were disinclined to take the fight to the next level. They had done right by their allies and driven the Samnites out of Campania. They had no interest for now in invading Samnium and trying to conquer a strong-willed, capable, and well-supplied army. Plus, the winds of discontent were blowing in from Latium, and the Romans knew full well that if they got entangled with the Samnites, the Latin communities would be in a strong position to leverage concessions from the Romans. So a treaty of peace was concluded between the Romans and Samnites. The Latins saw this as a tacit admission of weakness and, seeking a more personally beneficial arrangement with the Romans, decided to strike while the iron was hot. But before any sort of conflict with the Latins were joined, a further step was taken in the Publian, thanks to John for correcting my pronunciation, quest for a greater share in power. In 342 BC, not long after the mutiny of the garrison soldiers in Campania, the plebes pushed through another set of reforms that solidified their power. The package included the important provision that one of the consuls for each year not just could be a plebe, but had to be a plebe. But more importantly, it set the well-known and oft-cited requirement that 10 years must pass before a man could hold the same office twice. The move was designed, obviously, to prevent one man from gaining too much power, but at times the cure was worse than the disease, especially, for example, during the Second Punic War, when it became nearly impossible to run the war when the leadership kept changing. So though the 10-year requirement was followed and disregarded according to circumstance, it did set a cultural precedent strong enough that when, Between 104 and 100 BC, Gaius Marius was elected consul 5 times in a row. It was a scandal that engendered enough ill will that the social fabric of the state began to unravel. But that is for a much later date, probably sometime early next year at the pace we're going. When the Romans withdrew from fighting the Samnites, the Campanians and Latins both wanted to carry on with the fight. As I mentioned last week, the Samnites implored the Romans to put a stop to the aggression, but the Romans refused to order the Latins to do anything one way or the other. The Latins immediately took this to mean that if Rome did not feel strong enough to enforce its will, politics being the zero-sum game that it is, then that meant the Latins must be stronger than their supposed masters. They resolved to use this to their advantage. A delegation representing the Latin League was sent to Rome to demand a political reordering. Up to this point, the Latins had enjoyed varying degrees of Roman citizenship, usually trade and intermarriage rights, stopping short of full suffrage. The delegation asked of the Romans not just full suffrage, but also audaciously demanded that one of the 2 yearly consuls come from the Latin communities. The Romans were shocked and practically laughed the delegation out of the Senate. No Roman was going to submit himself to the rule of a mere Latin. The plebes had just guaranteed their own consulship and weren't about to give it up, while the patricians had just given up one of their consulships and weren't about to let go of the other. On the question of a Latin consul, the 2 classes were united. The Senate's, and I'm paraphrasing here, answer to the Latin delegation was, no, there will be no political reordering. We like things just the way they are, thank you very much. Do you not remember that we wiped the floor with you at Lake Regillus, and that's why things are the way they are? If you really want what you're asking for, then come take it, if you can. The Senate then immediately voted for war to teach the impertinent Latins a lesson. Legions were raised and sent out to meet the Latin force that had been massing in anticipation of the Senate's rejection of Latin demands. The consuls for that year were Titus Manlius Torquatus and our old friend and hero of the First Samnite War, Publius Decius, he of the grass crown. On a brief tangent, the Romans dated the past by reference to the consuls for a given year, rather than by an arbitrary numbering system, so that, for example, last week's battles with the Samnites were said to have taken place in the consulship of Corvus and Cossus, rather than in, say, 167, dating from the founding of the Republic, or 409, dating from the founding of the city. It seems a bit unwieldy to us, but the Romans liked it just fine. Down the road, this system of reference would lead to the Roman joke that events occurring in the year of Julius Caesar's consulship, 59 BC, took place not in the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but in the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Get it? The Romans could be a laugh riot when the mood struck. Anyway, in the consulship of Decius and Manlius, 340 BC by our reckoning, war with the Latins began. In the beginning, the outcome was very much in doubt. It had been years since the Romans had fought an enemy that so evenly matched them. It was almost like facing a mirror. The Romans and Latin forces were nearly identical in size. They used all the same tactics, spoke the same language, prayed to the same gods, and in most cases knew each other personally. There would not be any surprises or innovative tactics, just a standard straight-ahead infantry battle and victory to the strongest or luckiest. Both sides knew it, and knew heavy casualties loomed as force pitted itself against force. 2 legends emerged from the war, one revealing how the Romans were able to win a fight that seemed destined to produce a draw, the second hammering home the idea that obeying consular authority is paramount and the only way to maintain the critical discipline required for Rome to defeat its enemies. The first legend states that after the legions had built their camp near the Latin force and settled in for the night, both consuls had the same dream. In it, an apparition revealed that in the coming battle, the victorious side would sacrifice its commander, while the losing side would sacrifice its whole army. When they awoke, the 2 conferred and realized that they had had the same dream. They made a pact that each would lead one flank of the army, and whichever side began to fail first, that consul would charge into the enemy and seek death so the gods would grant their whole army victory. The second legend states that the consul Manlius had given orders to his troops that no one should engage the Latins until he had given the okay. He wanted the battle to start at the time and place of his choosing, and didn't want reckless brawling to spark a battle he wasn't prepared for. Manlius' son Titus, however, disobeyed the order while leading a cavalry detachment on patrol. They encountered a group of Latins, and Titus was challenged to single combat by one of them. Titus demurred, understanding his orders, but the Latins called him a coward and all sorts of other nasty names. His hackles raised, Titus accepted and proceeded to kill his challenger. Returning to camp with the spoils taken from his dead enemy, Titus was greeted by cheers, but the festive atmosphere died under the withering stare of his father, who ordered his son arrested. Manlius gave a brief speech in which he defended what he was about to do. His family, he said, would be torn apart by the punishment he was about to hand down, but that was far better than having the entire state torn apart by disobedience to consular authority. Then, without compassion and to the horror of his men, Manlius ordered his own son flogged and beheaded. Titus was given a hero's burial, and the army, from that point on, hated their commander, but it was, to Manlius' credit, a far more disciplined and professional army that was doing the hating than before. There is nothing new about either of these legends, and they are both retreads of previous stories. Those of you who know Greek history will recognize the familiar elements of King Leonidas' vision that Sparta must either lose a king or its freedom to the Persians, which led him to make his suicidal last stand at Thermopylae to save his city. And those of you who have followed this podcast will note that Manlius' decision to execute his own son follows closely the story of the consul Brutus and his treasonous sons from the early days of the Republic. Roman annalists were enamored with the idea that Romans of the past displayed a dedication to the state that had fallen out of fashion and needed to be rekindled. To the later Romans, just as it is today and in most other times and places, the past became bathed in the golden light of simple nobility and selfless virtue, whether or not any such thing was true. Legends aside, there was a battle, and it did take place, near the base of Mount Vesuvius. Yes, that Mount Vesuvius. The Latins and Romans lined up for battle, and the fight was joined, with Decius leading the left flank and Manlius leading the right. The fighting was intense and evenly matched, but soon the Roman left began to buckle under the weight of the Latin advance. Supposedly, Decius, knowing what he must do, donned a ceremonial purple-tinged toga and veiled his face. Then, fully armed, he mounted his horse and charged into the opposing line. The Latins were at first terrified at the appearance of this mad, masked horseman, and Decius killed not an insignificant number before he was finally taken down by a shower of spears. Manlius, watching his colleague fall, knew that victory was within his grasp. He held back a reserve of veteran soldiers, and, when the Latins were worn down, Manlius sent in the fresh troops and the Latins broke. Returning to Rome, it is said that Manlius was greeted with acclaim by the older men, but shunned by the young, who hated him for executing Titus, a well-liked young noble. And whether it was Decius' sacrifice or Manlius' tactics, the Latins were beaten. Over the course of the next year and a half, the Romans pursued a policy of laying siege to each of the Latin cities one by one, dividing them so none could offer aid to any of the others. It was during this stage of the war that the Samnites provided auxiliary forces to the Roman effort, joining the two enemies briefly under the same banner. It was in both of their interests to put down the rising Latins before the Roman-Samnite battle for Italian supremacy really got going. No sense in having some third-party wild card in the mix. They both agreed on that. Some of the Latin cities surrendered at the sight of the Roman army. Some resisted a little and then gave up, and some fought to the bitter end. When it was over, Rome had subdued the entirety of Latium. At this point, the Latin League was abolished once and for all, and any independent Latin identity was destroyed forever. In the aftermath, the Senate gathered and decided the fate of each Latin tribe on a case-by-case basis. Those who gave up quickly or never joined the rebellion were given full Roman citizenship. Those who resisted some were allowed to keep intermarriage and trade rights, but denied the vote, while those who led the revolt were turned off their land and their holdings were colonized by Roman citizens. This treatment of the Latins was typical of Roman official policy. Anyone who was predisposed to friendship and did not resist Roman rule was welcomed openly into the empire and given an array of rights and privileges,
while those predisposed to hostility and resistance were simply wiped off the map. Most nations and tribes fell into the former camp and found themselves well treated by their new Roman overlords. It was this policy of generosity that secured the longevity of the ethnically diverse empire. That, and the ruthless extermination of those tribes and nations who fell into the latter camp. The stage is now set for one of the most important wars in Roman history, the Second or Great Samnite War. It is comparable in historical importance to the Second Punic War, which saw the Romans defeat Carthage, and the Macedonian Wars, which brought Greece under Roman control. In the Second Samnite War, the Romans, for the first time, set themselves on a course of conscious expansion with an eye on winning a far-reaching empire. It was a decades-long fight, and the Romans nearly lost a number of times, but when it was over, Rome found itself in control of all Italy. But before we get into all that, I want to pause and give a fuller account of the Roman legion, how it fought, how it operated, and how it was commanded. The Samnite Wars marked a period of transition for the army, and this is a good time to take a look at how the Romans had fought in the past and how they would fight in the future. The strategy and tactics and formation of the legion would remain in place for the next 200-odd years until Marius came along and reorganized it yet again. And I want you to have a good picture in your mind of what things looked like as we move forward, because it will allow you to visualize the battles of the upcoming Punic Wars better, and later to fully understand why the Romans were able to so decisively defeat the Greeks. So next week we will learn about the Phalanx, its strengths and weaknesses, and why the Romans scrapped it in favor of the maniple system, how many men a centurion really led, hint, the answer is not 100, and what the word legion actually means. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. To answer one of the most basic questions about Rome, why was it able to control so much territory for so long, one need look no further than the Roman legion. There were myriad secondary reasons: competent hands-off administration, sound economic policies, and superior engineering skills. But at the beginning and end of the day, it was the legion that secured the longevity of Rome. No fighting force matched it in the ancient world. But its dominance was not the result of finding a perfect method of organizing and leading men and then sticking to that static model forever. Rather, the Romans constantly tinkered, rearranged, and improved the legions, depending on circumstances. One of the great virtues of Rome, and one the Romans themselves took immense pride in, was their ability to learn from their own mistakes and adopt the superior methods of their enemies. When I was in college, I took a course in ancient political theory where we studied Plato and Aristotle, the Sophists, and other Greek thinkers. But when we got to the Romans, apart from some cursory reading of Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, my professor spent the class periods teaching us legion infantry tactics and how the Roman roads and camps were built. That was Roman political theory, not discourses on the meaning of justice or comparative essays on state organization, but rather how best to build a wall and how to maintain lines of communication in the thick of battle. The Romans did not spend a lot of time with their head in the clouds, but they did spend a lot of time with their feet in the mud. The power, dominance, and stability and legacy of Rome is all wrapped up in its army. Understanding the legions is critical to understanding the Romans, and shifts in how the legions operated mirrored shifts in the socio-political world that surrounded them. I originally intended this section to be one episode, but as I progressed it kept growing and growing, and so, rather than inundating you with too much information, I have decided to divide it into two parts. Today I will give a brief overview of how the legions changed over the years, and then go into detail about the Greek phalanx in particular, what it was, why it was so strong, and what its flaws were. The Romans used the phalanx until the Samnite Wars, when they morphed into a new system I will detail next week. For those of you with a background in ancient history, I'm sure you've heard more than enough about the phalanx, but I want to make sure everyone is on the same page, and I think understanding infantry tactics is critical to understanding classical Mediterranean history as a whole. In general, and this is very general, the army of the Roman Republic had four distinct phases. The first phase was ushered in by Romulus when he founded the army. It was originally formed like any other barbarian horde, with a strong leader leading a mass of men who charged at the enemy and battled hand-to-hand, one-on-one, until one side overpowered the other. The second phase began roughly with the class reforms of Servius in the mid-500s BC. At this point, the Romans began to utilize the Greek phalanx, relying on disciplined, group-oriented attacks rather than the free-for-all of Romulus's day. This lasted until the mid-300s BC, when the Samnite Wars exposed dangerous flaws in the phalanx and forced the Romans to reorganize their entire army and start a third phase based around the maniple, which I will discuss at length next week. Later, around 100 BC, Marius ushered in the fourth and final phase of the Republican army, instituting a series of reforms affecting not just how the army fought tactically, but also how the soldiers were recruited, removing property qualifications and creating the first full-time professional legion. This was a major contributing factor to the death of the Republic and the rise of the Imperium. At this point in the podcast, we have reached one of those watershed moments, the mid-300s BC, that saw a transition from one of these phases to another. And this transition is particularly of vital importance because it moved Rome from having just another classical Greek hoplite army to having an army that was distinctly Roman. The Romans, as I've mentioned, were heavily influenced by the Greeks, not just in art and culture, but also in the employment of arms. In the mid-7th and 8th centuries BC, the Greeks adopted a formation of attack called the Phalanx, which was composed of individual soldiers called hoplites. The Phalanx was the most formidable method of attack in its day and spread throughout the Mediterranean, finding its way to Rome, as I said, around the mid-500s BC. Put simply, the Greeks abandoned the chaotic charges of man-to-man fighting in favor of a highly organized formation, which would charge and engage the enemy as one. For hundreds of years, the only thing that could stop a phalanx was another phalanx of equal strength, hence the speed of its adoption throughout the Western world. A phalanx was composed of a single line, 8 to 16 men deep, depending on the battlefield and number of hoplites available. As a rule of thumb, deeper was better for phalanxes, and there were accounts of phalanxes up to 50 men deep in some battles. Commanders had to make hard choices, however, because the line had to be long enough to prevent any outflanking maneuver, which meant certain death, so a balance was always sought between length and depth. At Marathon, for example, the Greeks gambled by spreading their phalanx thin to prevent the numerically superior Persians from outflanking them. The gamble paid off, but the Persians nearly did break the thin Greek line, and had they done so, the history of the world would have been altered dramatically. During battle, the men in the front line held their oval shields, called hoplons, hence the name hoplite, in their left hands and long spears in their right. The hoplites stood close together and in such a way that their shield protected the man to their left and the man on their right protected them. This formed a shield wall that was virtually impenetrable. In between the shields, the spears of the second, third, and sometimes fourth ranks shot through the gaps, stabbing and gorging anything they could. A mass of individual fighters would simply be massacred if they attempted a head-on attack. They would be unable to break through a well-disciplined phalanx. Now I know what you're thinking. If a phalanx was 8 or 12 or 16 men deep, and only the front 4 lines were attacking, what were the other 4, 8, or 12 lines doing? The answer is threefold, but all three folds relate to the all-important task of maintaining the cohesion of the phalanx. The first fold is that as the phalanx initially charged each other, and in the subsequent shoving match, the front lines had to be braced by the men behind them, so they literally, physically, could not be pushed back. The second fold is that the most common way a phalanx was broken was by retreat from the rear. Once men started running out the back, there was no more bracing, no more support, and the other army could push right through you. A deep line meant removing those back ranks from danger, and hence removing their desire to run away. The man in the back line of a 16-man phalanx was in no danger of being run through with a spear, so he wasn't going to run. It's basic psychology. The third fold is that the stable back ranks prevented the men in front, who really were in physical danger, from running away even if they were scared out of their minds. If anyone in the front ran, then the whole phalanx would break down and everyone would be slaughtered. Now I know what you're thinking again, and the answer is yes. the first few ranks of a phalanx was a really, really crappy place to be. Trapped between an enemy who was trying to kill you and friends who forced you to stay put even as they sat, essentially, on the sidelines. The only way to live if you were in the front was to stick together and move forward, so there was a motivational element to the formation as well. There was, indeed, a lot of psychology built into the phalanx. Maybe all that philosophizing on the human condition paid off. In a warrior society like Greece, though, men clamored to be in the front ranks because that's where all the honor and glory was, and where the commanders placed their best men. So, despite all the dangers, they didn't think the front was such a bad place to be. To each his own, I guess. Now, a last important word on the phalanx. It was designed for and used on flat, open plains, where the ranks could be deployed properly, and there were no holes in the line. In a phalanx, a single gap meant death. The survival of the army was absolutely dependent on an unbroken shield wall. In Greece, this worked well because both sides used phalanxes, and so both sought the same sort of terrain. But against an army who used vastly different tactics on unstable, hilly terrain, the phalanx was vulnerable, a fact the Romans would learn the hard way. In the hundreds of years that the Romans had used the standard phalanx, they had been well served because they were fighting either other phalanxes or Gallic hordes who were no match for a solid shield wall with hundreds of spears jutting out of it. But when they met the Samnites, the weaknesses of the phalanx became all too apparent. The steep, rough country of Samnium, where most of the fighting of the Samnite Wars took place, made it difficult to deploy and maintain a cohesive phalanx. Plus, the Samnite light infantry and cavalry, used to the terrain, were able to easily outflank the Romans. And as I said, an outflanked phalanx was as good as dead. This fatal flaw spelled the end of the Roman use of the phalanx. It was simply not maneuverable enough. When attacking head-on, a phalanx was indestructible, but once hit from the side or back, it was a sitting duck. The densely packed soldiers simply could not turn and set up the critical defensive shield wall in time, encumbered as they were with heavy armor and long spears. If given enough time, the left or right-hand column could reform into a front line, but in battle time was measured in seconds, and a cavalry detachment that managed to get around the line was charging through the ranks in a heartbeat, slaughtering the closely packed hoplites who could not even turn around to defend themselves. This was why the phalanx had to avoid being outflanked at all costs, and why, when the Samnites proved they could get around the Romans changed forever their organizational deployment to develop an immunity to this chronic disease. What the Romans developed was the system that has been handed down as the classic Republican army formation, which we will talk about in detail next week. The maniple system and its three-line deployment, famously referred to as a phalanx with joints. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last time, we focused on the Greek phalanx, the formation of battle used by the Roman army until the time of the Samnite Wars. This week I want to talk about the new system the Romans developed during and after their war with the Samnites. The new organizational structure would remain the standard for the next 250-odd years until the Marian reform of 107 BC and become known to history as the maniple system. It was called the maniple system because it was based around a tactile unit of 120 men called the maniple, which roughly translates as a handful. This unit was capable of acting independently of the rest of the army or in concert with the whole, giving Roman commanders an advantage over their predecessors who had to deal with the bulky single line of a phalanx designed only for closely coordinated forward movement. In a pinch, a general could now order off a single maniple to secure a ridge or plug a hole or turn to face an enemy from behind without jeopardizing the cohesion of the rest of the army. And the new Roman general had another advantage over his predecessor. The Romans abandoned the single line in favor of a staggered three-line deployment. At the outset of battle, the lines formed with 10 maniples in the front, 10 in the middle, and 10 half maniples in the back, arrayed in a checkerboard fashion. Some sources say there were 15 maniples in the front line, and some say there were 15 in the front too. The specifics are hard to weed out due to the lack of source material and the competing claims held therein. So I'm saying 10, 10, and 10 because that seems to be the general consensus, but just know that I could be wrong. And without a time machine, we'll never know for sure.
Somewhere between 10 and 15 in the front two lines anyway, and definitely 10 in the back. The front line maniples were made up of the youngest and most inexperienced soldiers, generally aged 16 to 20, out on their first campaigns. The second line was made up of soldiers in the prime of their lives, between the ages of 20 and 40. The back line was made up of the oldest troops, veterans of countless campaigns with all the wisdom and skill that follows from age and experience. Organizationally, each single maniple had 4 officers, 2 front, senior centurions, and 2 back, junior centurions. They were called centurions because they commanded a single century, the most basic organizational unit of the army, and a maniple was composed of 2 centuries, hence 2 officers. A Roman army century was not composed of 100 men, as is commonly and mistakenly believed, but rather 60 to 80 men. The senior of the 2 senior centurions was the commander of the maniple and placed in the front right when in battle. They were expected to lead by example and be the first ones in and the last ones out of any fight. The mortality rate among centurions was thus the highest in the army, but again, as with the front ranks of the Phalanx, men clamored for the position because of the honor it brought them and their families. The basic theory was to attack first with the front line only, who, being young, were strong and full of stamina. Ideally, the rest of the army would never have to attack, and the front line would take care of the enemy. But this rarely happened. Inevitably, the second line would be ordered in to support the first. These troops, hardened, strong, and experienced, were usually enough to secure victory. The enemy, worn down from fighting the Roman youth, would be no match for those youth plus an equal number of veterans. If this was not enough, however, the last line was ordered in to support. If this back line got involved, it meant that things were not going well for the Romans, but the old men were usually enough to break the back of a particularly stubborn enemy. The maniple system was based around the principle of time-release freshness. Opponents of Rome would attack all at once and with great fervor, often overexerting themselves by the belief that they could overwhelm the front Roman line easily and move on to the rest of the army. But things were rarely that easy for them, and, bogged down by the front line of Roman youth, the opposing armies became fatigued and were then routed when the rest of the Roman army got involved. Beyond these 3 basic lines of heavy infantry, there were 3 other important elements needed to complete the legion as it lined up for battle. First, there was the light infantry, made up of men rich enough to qualify for service, but too poor to afford all the gear needed to survive in heavy infantry fighting. In any given legion there were between 1,000 and 1,200 of these fighters, who, at the beginning of battle, stood in front of the 3 lines to mask the size and formation of the Roman army. When the signal for battle was given, the light infantry would rush the enemy and hurl spears and javelins, attempting to disrupt the cohesion and inflict some minor damage, before retreating quickly through the 3 lines to the back of the legion. Light infantry never made much of a difference in the actual fighting, having served their purpose if the enemy remained in the dark about Roman formations, and eventually, when the state began to take responsibility for the arming of soldiers, the light troops were phased out and folded into the rest of the lines. On the wings, as was typical of the day, the Romans placed the cavalry. Their job was to engage the opposing cavalry and take them out of the fight, so the 2 infantry lines had to fight head-to-head without help, a fight the Romans always felt they could win. Once the opposing cavalry was out of the way, the Roman horsemen would plunge into the enemy lines and attempt to do as much damage as they possibly could. In addition to these 2 basic tasks, the cavalry was always watchful of potential flanking maneuvers or surprise attacks from the rear. Constitutionally, the cavalry was initially made up of the richest Romans, the equites, but as the years passed, the Romans farmed out cavalry work to their allies, never being great horsemen themselves. And these allies were the 3rd element needed to complete a standard legion. Also stationed on the wings, between the Roman lines and the cavalry, the allies were somewhere in between heavy and light infantry. Through the Republican period they were led by Roman officers, but as time went on they began to be led by their own chiefs, or generals. The allies were required to contribute an equal number of infantry and twice the cavalry that the Romans themselves provided. These draft requirements would cause constant tension between Rome and her subjects, and was the main precipitous for the Latin War,
the Latins becoming fed up with sharing equally in the burdens but getting shafted in the spoils. In total, the Roman fighting strength was optimally between 8 and 10,000 men, with 4,200 Roman legionaries, an equal number of allies, and just shy of 1,000 cavalry. The numbers varied based on time, place, and mitigating factors, and these numbers are round, but they will give you some idea as to the size of the legion as it marched into battle. When it marched from place to place, however, it was attended by a baggage train of non-combatants numbering themselves in the thousands. So it would not be surprising to see a legion of 4,200 men marching through the countryside 15,000 strong. When actually engaging the enemy, the Roman tactics were straightforward. Each soldier was equipped with 2 spears and a sword. As they approached the enemy, they hurled the spears and inflicted as much damage as they could before meeting them hand to hand. And this tactic differs little in theory from today's artillery, which is supposed to soften up the enemy for an infantry attack. The Romans experimented with the composition and design of their spears, settling generally on an instrument that had a thin metal connector between the blade and shaft, so when the spear struck its target, the thin metal connector would bend under the weight of the heavy shaft behind it. And this served 2 purposes. It weighed down soldiers and shields that were struck, but it also made the Roman spears unusable to the enemy, for it was common practice in the ancient world to throw back spears hurled in by the enemy. When the gap between the armies was closed, the legionaries pulled out their short swords, double-edged and sharp at the tip. This could be used either for stabbing or slashing, and were incredibly destructive in close quarters. The famous gladius has not appeared yet in our narrative, which emerged after the Romans encountered Spanish swordcraft in the next century, but the principles behind that famous sword were already present. Once engaged in hand-to-hand combat, it was simply a matter of killing or wounding everything that moved until the enemy broke and fled. In addition to these forward, offensive-minded tactics, the new maniple system also had a built-in defensive strategy. If the front lines were overwhelmed, they could quickly retreat between the gaps in the middle line and regroup behind the more capable middle-aged fighters, and if they faltered, then they could all hide behind the third line, and by this time the first line would be ready to fight again, which allowed the Romans to retreat without having it devolve into a frightened, unorganized free-for-all. The Phalanx lacked this element, and once it broke, it was every man for himself. The maniple system also had the advantage of being far harder to flank than a phalanx. Any attempt to do so would either be met by the cavalry, backline maniples ordered forward, or by frontline maniples themselves peeled off from the main fight and sent in a different direction. All in all, it was a significant advancement from the phalanx, and as we will later see, when the Romans clashed with the Macedonians around 200 BC, the result would be a clear and decisive victory of maniple over phalanx. But it was not just the system that made the legion so dominant. It's not that anyone could be inserted and the result would have been the same. Nor was it the case that the Romans were bigger or stronger than their opponents. In fact, in many cases, facing huge lumbering Germanic tribes, the Romans looked puny by comparison. Rather, the legions prevailed because of a group discipline that became the nightmare of opposing armies. In general, ancient warfare was a passionate affair, with lots of yelling, chest beating, and frenzy. But the Roman legion was a cold, inhuman machine. They were never intimidated and rarely broke ranks. Their comrades could be dying to their right and left, but the legionnaire himself seemed unaffected and kept moving forward. This was unsettling to say the least, and sapped the morale of Rome's enemies. The Roman soldier did this not because he was unfeeling. Quite the contrary, the Romans were a passionate people. But in war, there was only one thing a legionnaire feared more than the enemy: his commanding officer. Roman discipline was notoriously harsh, though it was not without its positive aspects. It was based on a system of rewards and punishment that were designed to promote bravery and eliminate cowardness. Punishment ranged anywhere from psychological humiliation. For example, a disgraced sentry might be forced to eat standing up, so their comrades would always know who had lost their standard, to scourging for, say, disobeying orders, and up to death, a punishment that was handed down routinely when the actions of an individual put the entire army at risk, like, for example, falling asleep while on sentry duty. Woe to the sentry who fell asleep. He was stoned and beaten to death by his comrades. Not a pretty sight, but keeping watch was a sacred trust that could not be breached under any circumstances. It was simply too important. On the flip side, the Romans invented a plethora of fancy medals and awards given out to soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle. I've already talked about the grass crown given to a soldier who saves an entire legion, but there were literally hundreds of other honors. For example, an award was given to the first man over a wall when the army was assaulting an enemy camp or city. And this was not taken lightly. For whole centuries, lines and legions took it as a matter of great pride when one of their own took the prize. So when competing claims were brought to the attention of a commander, great care had to be taken in adjudicating the decision, because tempers were always running hot when awards were on the line. The most common rewards range from double rations, a huge motivator, to promises of more land when released from service, to heads of cattle. Anything a soldier valued would be metered out for instances of selfless bravery, which the Roman commanders were always promoting. There was a darkly humorous case during the Second Punic War of a commander promising extra rations for every enemy head brought back to camp. But the soldiers became so burdened by the work of beheading and carrying heads that they began to actually lose the fight. And in the heat of battle, the commander had to issue a proclamation that everyone would receive extra rations regardless of the heads, but they did have to actually win the fight, which the soldiers, now free of their grisly baggage, promptly did. This discipline allowed the Romans to keep their cool in battle and keep plugging away rather than running. They knew what would happen if their corpse was found on the field with a wound in the back. They would be buried without honor, and their family would be ostracized. Those who fled from Cannae, one of the greatest defeats in Roman history, were never allowed to return home, remaining in exile, fighting in Sicily until finally they were allowed to serve as bait for Hannibal and die with dignity in a suicide mission, something they had pleaded for years and were finally granted. The last thing I want to impress upon you about the superiority of the Roman legion over enemy forces was their meticulous attention to detail. It is often said that amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics, and the Romans embodied this belief. They took great care to always preserve supply lines, communication lines, and set up their camps in the most defensible possible position. This last was critical because the Greeks, for example, set up their camps to simply be close to the site of battle without thought to any other practical considerations. The Romans, however, took great care in ensuring they held the high ground and were in a well-defensible spot. A routed Roman army often staved off final defeat behind the walls of their camps, and many Roman victories were secured by overrunning the poorly constructed camps of their enemies. The Romans always scouted and protected sources of food and fresh water, and, knowing that this often meant the difference between a strong army in the field and a weak one, always sought to cut off the food and water supplies of their enemies before engaging in battle. Battles were often won or lost based on nothing more than the existence of a good breakfast on the day of the battle. So as much time as they spent trying to figure out how to neutralize opposing cavalry, they spent 10 times as much time thinking about how to secure pasture land for their horses. It was the boring details of making sure everyone had proper footwear and that the trenches were dug to a proper depth that really set the Romans apart from their enemies, who often had every intention of just showing up for a fight. The Romans never just showed up for a fight. They planned everything down to the smallest detail. The fight itself became almost an afterthought. So there you have it. That, in a nutshell, is the Roman Legion of the Republic. 3 lines made up of units of 120 men, with cavalry and allies protecting the wings. More versatile than the Phalanx, the maniple system would remain largely unchanged for the next 250 years, and it would be this incarnation of the Legion that did most of the heavy lifting of the territorial expansion throughout the Mediterranean. When we get to Marius, I will discuss at length the changes he introduced and how they changed the face of Rome forever. But that is for another time. Next week we will get back into the action as Rome prepares for her longest and most grueling challenge to date, the Second or Great Samnite War.